All right, so our next presenter is a person that is very active in the community, has his own podcast, which is the Habit Podcast. It just gave a wonderful 2+ hours workshop about a open source tool and works for Vectra networks. So I am sure this will be an incredible presentation. So I'm going to leave you guys with Tom the keynote.
Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Hopefully, awesome. Appreciate everybody's time today. As Rod said, my name is Tom Aquino. I am a cybersecurity practitioner. Been in the industry for quite a while. Come from kind of background is on the blue team side of things. My first cybersecurity proper job was working in a SOC or an MSSP, doing literally I did the job nobody else wanted to do, right? I took the great shift, worked like 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. or something crazy like that. There we go. So anyway, a lot of this experience, or what I'm going to be presenting to you here today, is informed out of kind of being a blue team operator. Since then, I've sort of moved over to doing a lot of SOAR oriented stuff and ultimately red team kind of stuff, and so that's what sort of informed my open source project that I've developed. Anyway, this talk is cybersecurity is warfare, so defend accordingly. Full disclosure, I don't have any military background. I am a civilian. Any active or retired armed forces member here today? Couple? Good. You guys keep me honest, because civilian talking to military veterans about warfare probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? Try not to screw it up. Anyway, that's the fact that I'm a civilian, I think, is actually critically important as an element of this conversation, right? Because if you just hit the I believe button for a second and accept what I'm saying here, that this is true, then, as civilians engaged in cybersecurity operations and as an occupation, it's important for us to understand warfare strategy. If we don't know we're fighting a war, we're at a disadvantage right out of the gate, right? And so that's really kind of the premise behind this. So I did a lot of research off of various warfare strategies, and I'm going to tie them into basically common cybersecurity practices that we can employ. We're going to do a little breakdown of a threat actor, their TTPs, and how this kind of warfare strategy stuff applies to that. So I suspect this will be informational even for the folks that probably know more about warfare than I do. So with that, let's go ahead and move on. So if we're going to talk about cybersecurity in the context of warfare, then it's really kind of necessary to go through a bit of a primer on warfare strategies. So we're going to start with that. Basically, there are three primary types of warfare. The most common one that is sort of simple and obvious is attrition warfare. It's just like it sounds. My guns are bigger than yours. I have more of them. I'm going to assault you with them until you relent. It's usually a very costly form of warfare, right? It costs a lot of money to get big guns distributed out. You're talking about large-scale operations, hundreds of thousands of hosts, hundreds of thousands of participants. And it's generally a centralized command kind of approach. So orders come from the top and they're distributed out with very explicit instructions that get pushed out through the command. And this is about as far as I'm going to go talking about attrition marketing. It's not especially useful or applicable in the context of cybersecurity. It is a little bit, but we're not really going to dive into any more of that because it's really not very complicated. The more interesting style of warfare is maneuver warfare. And this is, what I'll say about it right now. We're going to do a deep dive into this, or at least a moderately deep dive into it. What I'll say about it for now is that it's the opposite of attrition warfare, and that is decentralized in nature, right? So instead of orders coming from the top, it's more distributed. I'll get into how that has to work in a minute. When you're talking about unit size, instead of hundreds of thousands of participants or troops, you're talking about more like hundreds and thousands. So it's slightly smaller, but it's still a well-formed, organized militia, generally speaking. Oops, went ahead too far. And then the third one, you all are probably familiar with this, referred to as like guerrilla warfare or insurgent warfare. These all kind of fall into the irregular warfare category. And this is, basically very small units, where maneuver warfare, we're talking about, thousands of individuals or participants. Irregular warfare, we're talking about, maybe a unit of 100 folks that break up into, a small 6 or 12 groups that go carry out the various tasks, which we'll get into in a minute. And basically, all of this tends to be wrapped in some type of intelligence craft, right? So there's some sort of spy craft that is, regardless of the warfare strategy that you're employing, is used to inform these things and direct activities. So that's the basic primer. We'll get into some of the specifics now. So maneuver warfare, it's largely dependent, at least how it's evolved within the U.S. military, is largely dependent on this concept called the Boyd cycle. It was developed by this guy named John Boyd. He's an Air Force colonel who's a bit of a celebrity amongst military folks. Definitely encourage you to dig this up. It is this concept that it's also referred to as an OODA loop, because OODA stands for observe, orient, decide, and act, right? And the concept of a loop being that you have to progressively go through this process over and over and over again. And so a maneuver is really the act of going through the OODA loop and basically outmaneuvering your opponent with speed and precision. So there's a couple of elements that are sort of implicit or required to be present in order for this to work. The first is, that decentralized element that I talked about. So empowered decision making is really a key component of this. You've got to give your folks in the field the ability to make decisions. And if you think about the speed being a critical element of maneuver warfare, if you have to observe the situation, report it up the chain of command, and then wait for orders in order to make your next move, that whole process can be exceptionally slow, right? And so your ability to move quickly basically evaporates. And so really the key element of this is that you have to operate with the expectation that the people that are front and center in the battle are going to be the ones who are most able to orient around what is happening, how the situation has changed, whatever the next step needs to be taken. They're best suited to be able to make that decision and then act on it and do so quickly. And so that implies this notion of intentions over instructions, right? So rather than telling your team, I want you to do X, Y, and Z, you tell your team what your expected outcome is, give them guidelines on how to carry that out, right? Instructions are okay, but it's more so an indication of, these are some ways that you could go about accomplishing this, but ultimately how it's done is left up to the people that are, on the ground carrying it out, right? So it's, you tell them the what and the why and let them figure out the how. Okay, so intentions over instructions. And then if you're going to empower decision-making amongst your, amongst your team, if you're going to give them intentions over instructions, mistakes are going to be made. So you really got to be tolerant of mistakes is another core component of this. All right, I'm going to pick up the pace here a little bit because there's a lot to get through. There's basically 3 elements of maneuver warfare that are required in order to carry it out effectively. It's this concept of mission type orders, short punked, and surfaces and gaps. We're going to get into each of those. So mission type orders is that intentions over instructions bit that I was just talking about. So this is where you really sit down and figure out, what are we trying to accomplish and why, and how do we communicate that out to the broader team. The short punct is it translates, it's a German word, it translates into focus of effort. A little interesting aside, many of the aspects of maneuver warfare are actually oriented in like German command. And this is, largely some of the tactics that enabled them to be so effective in decimating Europe during World War II. And so it was, sort of studied and adopted by a lot of academics after that, because they realized how incredibly effective it was. So one of the things that kind of held over from that was this concept of short punct, which is basically, your focus of effort, which means, where you are going to direct the majority of your forces and attention. And then the last bit here, surfaces and gaps. Quite simply, your strengths and weaknesses, but it's referred to in maneuver warfare as surfaces and gaps because this is how you often confront them. It's how you're going to experience these strengths and weaknesses. You encounter a surface as a strength, and it's going to be where their primary defenses are, and in between those defenses, you're going to find holes or gaps that you can apply your short puncts to, right? So your focus of effort gets directed at gaps. If you're going against surfaces, you're going to have a tough go at things, right? So that's really kind of what's driving this is, the notion of being able to figure out, like, what are we going to accomplish, or what's our objective here, and then let's go evaluate where the enemy's surfaces are. Let's figure out where their gaps are, and then we're going to put our focus of effort on those gaps. So some of this might start to sound familiar, right? Like this kind of sounds like what we're defending against from a cybersecurity standpoint, right? And one of the key elements of, so there's three other supporting factors here that go into everything I just talked about. And one of them is the reconnaissance pool. So the question is, well, if we're targeting enemy surfaces and gaps, how do we determine where those surfaces and gaps are? So maneuver warfare has this term called recon pool, where you're basically sending out a reconnaissance screen and doing the work to figure out where the enemy surfaces and gaps are. So again, sounding really familiar to the kinds of things that the adversaries are doing that we're likely defending against, right? They're going to start with some kind of reconnaissance and work their way into figuring out where the holes are that they can move in through into your environment. In addition to reconnaissance pull, there's this concept of firepower that's probably pretty obvious with warfare, but in maneuver warfare, it's oriented around this concept of combined arms, which basically means it's not enough to have one type of attack. You have to mount multiple attacks together that effectively put your enemy on the horns of a dilemma, as the quote here says. I pulled this out of a book called the Maneuver Warfare Handbook. And it's a really short piece of work, actually, so definitely recommend digging into it. It's really easy to read, but it's basically one of the seminal works on this particular topic. So the author here, William S. Lind, is basically talking about what it means to put the enemy on the horns of a dilemma. And it's essentially this notion of, when I'm pursuing multiple types of attack at the same time, one of those types of attack, in order for you to defend against it, should make you vulnerable to something else. And my second attack should exploit the fact that you're vulnerable because of the first one, right? So combined arms, put your enemies on the horns of the dilemma. Right, and then there's the counterattack. Not a whole lot to say about this, other than there's basically kind of a couple of key elements to it, which are timing has to be, counterattack has to be decisive and strong. You really got to knock the opponent out, like really make sure that it's effective at the point where you execute it, and it has to be well timed. That might seem obvious, like in order to be effective, you got to counter strike just at the right time, but it's not just the timing in order to make your connection, it's also the timing of making sure that it's effective. If you counterattack too early, that the enemy can regroup and then, it hasn't really had any impact, right? So you really got to counterattack at the time where you are able to completely knock them off of their position and they're not able to recover from it. Okay, so we'll move into irregular warfare. As I said before, this is really about small units. So this is really kind of born out of the notion that people that are engaging in this type of warfare, they have some kind of material inferiority that sort of forces them to engage this way. And because of the various benefits that are gained from irregular warfare, it disrupts the enemy's superiority advantage, essentially, right? And so the three elements that really define irregular warfare: small units, guerrilla tactics, and long-term commitment. So I'll jump into these real quick. The small units are really about stealth and speed, right? So you're looking to be able to move quickly, move covertly, and attack. Take advantage of the sort of surprise attack that comes from that. Guerrilla tactics, things like robberies, acts of terrorism, sabotage, etc. Basically unexpected activities that are going to catch your adversary by surprise. The term guerrilla, actually, for me, I think it's probably just because of when I grew up. Like when I heard that, I initially thought, or immediately kind of directed my thoughts towards like South America and all the guerrilla activities that happened down there was maybe through the Reagan era, right? And as I was doing some research on this, I found that actually the term originated from Spaniards in the early 1800s who were defending Spain against the Napoleonic forces that were invading, like 1804 to 1815, something like that. So this has been around for a really, really long time, specifically termed, guerrilla warfare since then. And one of the sort of hallmarks of this is that it's usually an embedded force that's defending against some kind of invading force, right? And so I think there's something interesting to take from that. Because it's an embedded force, it's easy to have long-term commitment for them, right? It's sort of like, hey, I live here, you guys are visiting, I can do this all day, right? And how long are your troops going to suffer from swamp boot and dysentery before they're going to be ready to pack it up and head home? Like, as a small unit, I can go attack your supply line and be back home, having a warm meal and a shower and sleeping in my own bed, right? So I can really keep at this for a really, really long time. That's kind of the notion of the long-term commitment behind this. And again, I think there's some things to take away here as cybersecurity defenders, right? Like they're invading on our turf, so we can get irregular and have our long-term commitment is something that's relatively that's sort of an advantage for us. Okay, the intelligence craft stuff. I'm going to blaze through this because it's there. We're kind of challenged on the cybersecurity front to actually carry out every facet of this. Although it is changing a little bit, I've seen lately in like Australian news, the government there is really talking about sort of uncorking things in terms of allowing defenders to attack back at or hack back at their attackers. This is generally not something that's been allowed or acceptable in the industry up to this point. It's in consideration, but certainly that kind of limits how far we can go with an intelligence craft. It's basically, these three things: overt intelligence, clandestine intelligence, and counterintelligence and deception. So overt intelligence, we commonly in the industry call it OSINT, right? Open source intelligence, because we're marketing people and we like to rebrand things in the cybersecurity industry, I guess, but it's been around for a really long time, just called overt intelligence. This is basically anything that's publicly accessible. I thought it was interesting, just in my research around this, like the practitioners that really engage in this kind of stuff, they'll even go so far as observing like plays, reading novels that are produced by whatever the target adversary is, because or the target country, because it informs sort of the state of popular culture in the region, right? So there's just really nothing is off limits when it comes to overt intelligence, is at the end of the day what it comes down to. So clandestine intelligence, simplest, it's just well concealed reconnaissance, right? So basically, adversary puts up a series of blockades, and you're trying to work through those blockades to get access to information that you shouldn't otherwise be able to have. And then the counterintelligence or counter-espionage and deception, kind of two sides of the same coin. If you're engaging in one, you probably are, if you're doing any kind of counterintelligence, you're really trying to determine who's going through the process of trying to get intelligence on you. And while you're determining that, you are probably engaging in some degree of deception to, give them a sort of the wrong direction to go, right? And get them off the scent, if you will. Okay, so we're gonna shift gears here for a second and talk about game theory. Not to trivialize warfare, but game theory is something that's applied to warfare strategy and has been for a long time. And there's some aspects of it that make a lot of sense. And we'll come back to the warfare sort of comparison here in a minute, but just to give you a quick kind of background on the aspect of game theory that I think is very applicable here is this concept of finite games versus infinite games. And so game theory basically says if there are two players, a game exists, right? So if you're talking about any kind of warfare scenario, if there's usually opponents engaged in operations against one another, so that kind of implies that a game exists. All right, so a finite game is basically the games that we're all familiar with, games we played as kids, games we watch on TV. There are known players, a fixed set of rules or agreed upon set of rules, and basically an agreed upon objective or outcome. And some particular phase of the game is reached, and whoever gets there first wins, or whoever has the most after a certain period of time or whatever wins. That's basically the concept of finite game, right? Whereas an infinite game is a combination of known and unknown players, so you may not necessarily be aware of all the participants that are involved. There are no agreed upon rules, and the objective, because there are no agreed upon rules, there's also no agreed upon objective, which basically means that the primary objective is just to perpetuate the game, right? To keep the game going. And a good example of this is politics, right? So politics, we might not necessarily think of as a game. And even if you do, you might look at the surface of it and think of it like a finite game, which is, somebody's attempting to win an election. And so that feels like a very finite game sort of scenario, right? But if you kind of peel the onion back, what you find is, there are known and unknown participants. The person engaging in the election or attempting to get elected may be the known participants, but there are a bunch of people under the scenes that are behind the scenes that are supporting them, right? And the rules are kind of, there may be some surface level rules, but behind the scenes, again, it's sort of no holds barred, right? Like you try to entrap your adversaries in scandals or uncover scandals to make them look bad, right? There's all this other superfluous stuff going on that has nothing to do with the election whatsoever, and that's kind of what makes this an infinite game. And then the objective of perpetuating the game, it's not just about winning the election, it's about staying elected, it's about staying in office, carrying out some secondary agenda that may not necessarily be even related to the campaign that you ran on, right? So really, really good example of politics is absolutely an infinite game. So why am I going through this? Well, there's this concept called game equilibrium, which is if you have two players engaging in the same type of game, you basically get equilibrium out of that. So you've got a finite game player up against a finite game player. There will be balance. You're okay in that situation. If you have someone engaging in what they know is to be an infinite game against an opponent that understands they're engaging in an infinite game, then again, you have equilibrium. But when you engage in a game where one opponent is understanding that it's an infinite game, the other opponent thinks they're playing a finite game, now you get imbalance, right? And this, generally speaking, creates an advantage for the player engaging in an infinite game. And the reason for that is very simply they're not constrained by the same set of rules that the finite game player is constrained by, right? They're not looking for the same types of objectives or outcomes that the finite game player is looking for. Okay, so bringing this back to the warfare strategy aspect of it, you basically have this concept of warfare equilibrium. Sorry, I didn't realize that was on that. At least a little bit. So you have the same kind of thing that exists with warfare equilibrium, right? Which is at the point where you have somebody, two opponents engaging in attrition warfare, they're basically force against force. And, it's kind of a little bit of a coin toss of who's going to come out ahead, right? It's, whose guns are bigger, who has more of them, whatever. But generally speaking, you have equilibrium. But when you have somebody engaging in attrition warfare against an opponent that's engaging in maneuver warfare, now you've got an imbalance here, right? And again, in this scenario, I would call the attrition warfare sort of a finite game and the maneuver warfare the infinite game, right? Because they're engaging in a battle where the rules are different or non-existent as far as the attrition warfare operators' sort of expectations are that things need to be a certain way, and the maneuver warfare operators are going to undermine those expectations effectively. But again, somebody engaging in maneuver warfare against someone engaging in irregular warfare, you sort of have the same situation, right? Which is there are more expectations in place for those operating maneuver warfare, fewer expectations, they kind of break the rules in irregular warfare and instantly get an advantage as a result. I didn't put it up here because it just made the slide a little too busy, but if you had, attrition warfare against irregular warfare, it would be the same thing. The irregular warfare would have an advantage over the attrition warfare. So I go through all of this because bringing it back to cybersecurity, I've seen for years that, we're pretty much playing an attrition warfare game as cybersecurity defenders, right? How many folks have heard about an operation where they have some kind of rule in place where they're going to touch every single high and critical security alert that comes into the SIM, right? I swear, I used to work for a SIM vendor and we had customers that did this and talking about literally 200 million events a day, and maybe 20% of them were, high and critical severity, and somebody had to touch every single one of those things. That's attrition warfare, right? That'll make you want to go throw yourself in front of your own guns, right? That's exhausting. Nobody wants to do that, but it's that kind of, I'll say, limited creativity stuff that has sort of plagued us in this industry for a really, really long time. Now, if we're going to, really kind of subscribe to this warfare, cybersecurity as warfare approach, then, we can take advantage of some of these other well-established warfare concepts to enable us to be more effective. So let's talk about what an ideal strategy is. There is some aspect of attrition warfare that's useful. It's the my guns are bigger than yours and I have more of them aspect of it. At least, be the team with the most effective weapons on the battlefield, right? There's definitely some benefit to that. The highly effective weapons wielded in an adaptive manner. So some element of maneuver warfare incorporated into this, right? Wielded in an adaptive manner, targeting the enemy's gaps, using unexpected tactics with long-term focus, right? So really what we're doing is drawing from aspects of all of the different warfare strategies and kind of making them work to our benefit in a manner that gives us the most strategic advantage, right? So it's a little bit of everything. So we're going to dive into how we actually carry this out. And by the way, it should all be informed by intelligence. As I said before, we're probably going to be limited to like the overt intelligence kinds of stuff, but we'll actually go through an exercise here that I think falls into the highly effective weapons and informed by intelligence elements. So I chose Deep Panda Black/Blackvine as a threat actor that we can dive into and actually put this to work in a practical sense. These guys, I'll give you a quick overview of this threat actor. They've been active since 2012. Maybe not as active anymore, but there's a lot of information out there about the types of TTPs and the activities that they were engaged in and whatnot. So really good reference example for this process or this exercise for us to go through. So their targets are commonly targeting energy, government, defense, healthcare, financial, travel, telecommunications, and their motive is generally espionage. At least we know that to be the case now. We didn't necessarily back in 2012, 2015. We didn't know that, but their most noteworthy event was Anthem Health. So if you guys remember, Anthem Health, one of the largest health insurers in the country at the time, back in around February 2015, it was originally reported that they were breached, 80 million patient records exposed, so really big deal. And common findings, basically they used watering hole attacks, zero-day exploits, and they used custom developed malware that they frequently updated in order to bypass defenses, and just generally be very effective. There's a lot of information about these guys in this source reference that I have up here. It's this was one of the early investigations into the Anthem Health breach. Was produced by John DiMaggio while he was at Symantec. So this is the report that he created on that. It's Symantec's owned by Broadcom, so that's where you'll find it. So let's dive into their TTPs. I have the TTP numbers on here, the MITRE ATT&CK framework numbers on here. Don't worry about trying to keep track of all of this. I'm actually going to make this presentation available for everybody when we're done here. But just for understanding the types of activities that they engaged in, how they accomplished what they were doing, we're talking about basically either using spear phishing or drive-by download, watering hole attacks for their initial access. So these are the compromised TTPs, by the way, like the pre-compromise and compromised stuff. Basically using spear phishing, drive-by downloads, etc., and then several defense evasion techniques in order to bypass your basic antivirus or EDR defenses. Back then, EDR wasn't quite as advanced as it is now, so they were doing some really basic things like using legitimate certificates to sign their malicious code and things of that nature. And I mentioned they often updated their malware in order to bypass defenses, because they'd go figure out what indicators the antivirus vendors were using to detect their stuff, and then just remove that or change it in their code and reissue it and go after another target, right? So constantly evolving their stuff. So along with these, the TTPs in black were things that I was able to find definitively have been reported about this threat actor. The ones in red are kind of implied, right? So in order for them to be able to carry out this initial access and defense evasion stuff, they had to have engaged in some kind of reconnaissance, right? So I pulled in those TTPs as well. They likely had to spend some time gathering information about their victim, the victim's organization, the victim's identities that they went after. They used resources like open websites, domains, technical publications, whatever they needed to use in order to grab these. And in some cases, the last one in red there, phishing for information, it's very likely that an adversary like this is going to use phishing and actually get, some kind of information elicited out of the environment that they wouldn't normally have access to. The phishing aim may not be to actually initially compromise the environment. It's just, trying to get a better understanding of how things operate, right? So really common for that sort of thing to take place. Moving on to the post-compromise bit, this might be a little bit hard to read, but I'll walk through it in detail. So the first aspect of it is command and control. So these guys are known to use web-based protocols for their command and control processes or protocols. Their malware is communicating over to a command and control server over HTTP or HTTPS. So they try to blend in their traffic. They use PowerShell, so that the second category is execution. They've been known to use PowerShell scripting in order to carry out various aspects of their campaign. They are using various defensive evasion techniques. The one specific example that was called out was just the fact that while they're using PowerShell, they're hiding windows that they're executing this stuff in, but I'm sure it's not limited to that. They use various privilege escalation and persistence tactics. So one example was given, they're using this process called sticky keys associated with remote desktop protocols. So you're basically able to get access to a machine that's authenticated to via RDP by using sticky keys and capturing the credentials or bypassing the login account. And then the lateral movement bit, they've been known to use Windows admin shares in order to find information that ultimately they use to move laterally with. So they'll crawl shares, get maybe find credentials, things like that. And then they're also known to use for additional aspects of lateral movement. They're known to use WMI, so Windows Management Instrumentation. They'll use that to execute code remotely on other machines inside of the environment. And then collection is sort of the obvious thing. They're going to find the data they're after. They're going to collect it. And they're going to exfil it. Okay, so kind of breaking this down even a little bit further, then the TTPs in red here again are sort of the implied things. So in order for them to be effective at privilege escalation, persistence, lateral movement, all of this stuff, they were going to have to do some kind of discovery in the environment, right? So they had to do network service discovery, account discovery, network share discovery, these sorts of things. And ultimately, in the Anthem case, in the Anthem breach, the way that their presence was discovered was because a database administrator had seen a series of queries issued against a database that were that came from his credentials. His credentials were used to execute this query, but he knew that he did not perform this action, and so that was kind of the thing that surfaced it for them. The implication there is, the attack didn't start with that individual, so somehow they got that individual's credentials in order to be able to get access to this database and ultimately pull the data in question out of it, right? So again, we don't know exactly how the credential access took place, but we know that they had to do something there. Okay, so we walked through the TTPs. Let's pull this back then to the warfare strategies, right? Like basically all of this stuff maps to maneuver warfare to me. Like I look at this, I'm like, okay, these are all tactics or techniques that align with maneuver warfare. And I can put, the various things that we talked about with maneuver warfare to this. So all the reconnaissance stuff that qualifies as a recon pull, all of the initial access and execution stuff, that's your focus of effort, right? That's the short prompt. And the specific tools that they use to evade defenses, that all falls into the firepower category, right? So we can move, that's on the compromise side. Let's move back to the post-compromise stuff. And again, we're looking at a bunch of maneuver warfare tactics here. Basically, all of that command and control, execution, defense evasion, that is all stuff that falls into the firepower category. Discovery, internal discovery is again your recon pull activity, and then your privilege escalation, persistence, lateral movement. That's your focus of effort again. That the second set of execution stuff, the Windows instrumentation, WMI activity falls into the firepower category, and then credential access is recon pull again. And then your collection is the short prompt. So you can basically go through, all of the TTPs that you can pull out for an attacker, and some set of well-known, events that or attacks that they've participated in. You can go through this process of pulling these TTPs out and then assigning them to the various maneuver warfare or irregular warfare categories. And I'll say in the case of this threat actor, there's not really a whole lot from an irregular warfare standpoint, but if you were to look at some of the current threat actors that are, Revel or the popular ones that are engaging in ransomware stuff, that definitely falls into the irregular warfare category, right? When you look at some of the stuff that Russia is pulling on the Ukraine with, destructive malware, the wipers and things like that, that definitely falls into the irregular warfare category, right? So all of this stuff is highly applicable from a warfare standpoint. Talking about attribution for a second, this basically, at the time when this was initially reported and some of the early research took place, basically concluded that there's an organization run out of Beijing, China called TopSec that they were able to attribute a lot of this activity back to. It was based on domains that were registered, certificates that were created. There was a lot of information that they were able to leverage to kind of work their way back to TopSec being the entity associated with this. And initially, everybody thought that this was a criminal act, that it was monetarily motivated. But it turned out after, a bit more discovery, suddenly coming back to like the overview where we were talking about the targets, there's, big swath of targets that are involved with this particular threat actor. And when they really started to understand how this information was exposed, could be used, it became clear that this was an espionage-oriented event, right? And one of the things that was material about this, the Anthem Health breach was really interesting from the standpoint that Anthem Health was one of the health insurers that was contracted to the U.S. government to do a lot of stuff for government employees, right? In particular, the CIA was using them basically to carry out things like physicals and health checks and whatnot. And so this information, they were able to cross-reference with travel records and basically get very detailed information about who was moving through Africa, Europe, and Asia that were basically CIA operatives, right? And so, when you think about what we're doing as defenders, working for a company like Anthem Health, we're civilians working for what seems like a civilian organization, and yet, they're embroiled in this spider web, basically, of espionage that's being used to carry out a nation-state motivated attack, right? So really, really interesting stuff. And I'll also say all those TTPs that we went through, even if you're looking at a criminal threat actor, they're basically using the same tactics. So, it would be the equivalent of, somebody like this monetarily motivated robbing a bank, but, they're robbing a bank with weapons of mass destruction, typically, right? As opposed to, handguns. Like, this is the equivalency that's happening right now. And so, to look at the criminal threat actors and say like, oh, well, they're just motivated for money, that's not really warfare. But if they're using the same tactics that nation state threat actors are using, then I don't know how you discount that, right? It's basically the same strategy, so you got to defend against it the same way. So coming back to the highly effective or the ideal strategy for a second, I'm going to skip past the first two and really kind of focus on the last three, and then we'll recap. So targeting the enemy's gaps. Well, how do you figure out what the enemy's surfaces and gaps are? The way I look at this is adversaries have an advantage when they have moderate to significant knowledge and moderate to significant control. So opposite to that, they're at a disadvantage when they have limited knowledge and limited control. So we can actually use that little awareness or insight to figure out where those surfaces and gaps exist. So let's go through a quick exercise, breaking down these TTPs. We looked at it from a warfare strategy standpoint, or maneuver warfare, like recon pull versus firepower, etc. Let's break it down from surfaces and gaps perspective. Well, when you look at the reconnaissance bit here, if you ask yourself, well, do they have moderate to significant knowledge, moderate to significant control? The answer on the recon side is no, they don't. So that's a gap for them, right? Whereas the initial access stuff, generally speaking, they know how their malware is going to execute. They know how your defenses are going to respond to it because they've tested all of that stuff, right? They have the ability to, test and validate these things. And so they have a moderate degree of control there and knowledge, right? So that would be a surface. Same thing with the defense evasion stuff. They know how to evade the defenses. They know code signing is going to be effective, right? So they've got a moderate degree of knowledge and control over this. So that makes that a surface. On the post-compromise side, again, the command and control aspect definitely is surface. The reason I say that, it might seem like, well, they're controlling something inside the environment that they don't have direct access to, so their control is limited. The interesting aspect of this is, and we talk about this a lot at my employer, actually, when an adversary is controlling a remote machine through malware that they've developed, they actually control both sides of that communication from the standpoint of how the malware communicates with the command and control server, right? Or how their implant, you don't have to call it malware, how their implant communicates with the command and control server. They're controlling whether it uses HTTP, HTTPS, maybe it uses a Slack API, maybe it uses a Microsoft GraphQL API. Like they're really doing a lot to blend their traffic in with your normal everyday traffic, right? So they've got maximum control there, basically. And they know exactly how those protocols are going to behave. They know exactly how their implant is going to behave in terms of communication. So again, all surfaces, the command and control, the execution, the defense evasion, all surfaces. But this discovery bit, that's a gap for them. They have limited knowledge of your environment and limited control of your environment, right? So this is actually pretty obvious. They've got to go do some network discovery, some account discovery, whatever they have to do to really dig that information out. Privilege escalation and persistence, lateral movement, again, all the same stuff. They know how these things are going to execute. They know what they're expecting it to do. So that's a surface. Execution, same thing. That's a surface. The credential access, that's another gap. They don't know your credentials in your environment, right? So they've got to go figure that out. The last one, though, collection, that one is also a gap where it's something that I called like the Schwerpunkt earlier when we were going through the Irregular Warfare designations. But when it comes to actually determining where the data is in your environment that they need to pull out, and the process of accessing and pulling out that data is something that's going to expose them, right? So that, again, becomes a gap for the enemy. Again, going back to what I said before, limited knowledge, limited control, right? And data collection is an aspect of that where they have at least limited knowledge about the data itself. Okay, so how do you target the enemy's gaps? Well, we just kind of broke it down. Like basically the enemy has to figure out where do things of value reside. So they're going to network port scan internally. They're going to share scan internally. You know, it used to be a thing like back when I started in a SOC, we were looking at port scans from the outside, like people port scanning our perimeter, and eventually everybody stopped paying attention to that because, yeah, if you're connected to the internet, you're going to get port scanned. Like, oh well, right? It doesn't really serve much useful information, right? But internally, are you watching for port scans inside of your network? Because it's actually not very common for that to happen. Right? Yeah, your vulnerability scanner is going to do it. Domain controllers will do some stuff that looks like port scanning occasionally, but generally speaking, it's pretty easy to put a few exclusions in place and then identify significantly anomalous behavior off of that is port scanning oriented, share scanning oriented, etc. Then they've got to answer the question, who has access to things of value? So they're going to do LDAP queries that dump your entire Active Directory domain, right? They're going to run excessive RPC calls to figure out where those users that have access to stuff of value are logged into. And so there's really easy things that you can do to identify this kind of behavior that is not common in most environments. Like, yeah, lots of LDAP queries might be happening, but there aren't very many LDAP queries where somebody's dumping the entire Active Directory domain. There's not very many where people are filtering specifically for members of the domain admins group or some other admins group, right? So these are things that are relatively easy to spot. And then the last one there, what are the credentials for those who have access, right? They're going to have to do something to get access to those credentials. So whether they're scraping files, looking for credentials stored in a file, they're using Kerber roasting, registry hive dumping, LSAS prop dumping stuff. All of that activity is relatively easy to spot because it's abnormal. Okay, so jumping into the using unexpected tactics bit, you know, set tripwires. This is where our opportunity to be deceptive comes in. We can take advantage of the fact that our adversary doesn't know much about our environment. So create an open admin share, call it an admin share, right? But make it accessible to lots of folks, and dump a PowerShell script in there with valid credentials. And, you know, make sure that those valid credentials don't have access to much, and then go put a sorry about that. Go put a rule in place that alerts the whole world basically when those credentials get used, right? This is a very, very simple thing to do. That the adversary, we know they're looking for credentials, so give them the credentials we want them to have, right? And trip them up with that. Make them expose themselves. create a sensitive folder in SharePoint and put a bunch of fake documents in it and look for people accessing those specific documents in mass, right? Put 100 documents in there. If somebody's touching all of those things, it's very likely somebody that doesn't know anything about your environment, right? And you can do the same thing on the database side, like go into a production database and put a fake table in there, make it a really complicated table with a bunch of data in it, and see who's interacting with it, right? There's a point where somebody goes in, does a describe on that table or queries that table, you know something is up, right? And when I talk to people about this, their instant reaction is like, well, you know, what about just a curious insider that's like browsing around? Like, first off, if you got a curious insider that goes and finds a PowerShell script and pulls the credentials out of it and uses them, I'm going to be highly suspicious about the motivations of that insider, right? Like, that's pretty questionable behavior. But you know what? Go work with the department heads anyway. Go to the HR team and be like, hey, on your HR server, we're going to put a folder in here with some sensitive data or supposed sensitive data in it, right? And you know, share the details with the team. Like, give them a heads up, let them know what you're doing and why you're doing it. Perfectly fine to just make sure they don't write it down somewhere that the adversary is going to find, right? So that they know where all your tripwires are. But the point is that if you do this appropriately or effectively, this is a very low false positive approach to getting the adversary to trip up and expose themselves. All right, we're almost done here. The long-term focus bit, I'm going to dive into this for a second. So this is kind of, you know, what we talked about early on, emphasize ownership, empower your team, right? You know, the intentions over instructions stuff. You really got to focus on building culture within an organization where you're trying to defend something, because turnover is devastating, right? When you lose key members of your team, your ability to replace those people is really devastating. And we have something like an 18-month average of turnover for employees in this industry. I think in a lot of scenarios, it's actually closer to 6 months, where people just get burnt out working in a SOC or any kind of, you know, security engineering environment. They get burned out really, really quickly. We need to extend that out to, like, you know, a good organization will have people in place for 5 years, right? Like, carrying all that tribal knowledge forward. That's what we really should be striving for as an industry. And the only way that's going to happen is keeping that long-term focus, you know, building a really, really strong culture, validate your technology and process, but embrace failure. You know, don't beat people up for failing, and celebrate people when they find failure. If they've tested something and found that it didn't work, you got to celebrate that, right? Like, really elevate it, raise it up, make sure everybody knows that this is something that we're really going to embrace, and then create growth plans based on people's abilities. If your growth plan in the organization revolves around tenure or time, you might get people that stick around for 18 months because they want to have, you know, some steady, you know, kind of work history on their resume, right? But they're not going to stick around much longer than that, right? So you got to focus on abilities and then train around those abilities that are built into your growth plan, right? So that you can give people not only, here's what you need to do in order to excel in this organization, but here's the training we're going to give you to make sure that it happens. Train on network fundamentals, OS fundamentals, architecture, application, all the fundamentals of the stuff that you really got to focus on. It's not about training on cybersecurity specific things, how to attack, how to identify attacks. It's more about understanding the fundamentals really, really well, and those other instances will jump out at those people that understand these things, right? And then I'd say that the last bit of this, TTPs, surfaces, and gaps, go through that exercise that we just did, right? Go through the process of identifying for a new threat actor that's, you know, in the news. Go find the information you can get about them, document their TTPs, assign their, you know, maneuver warfare or irregular warfare designations to them, figure out where their surfaces and gaps are. You know, if you're going through this process on a recurring basis, you're going to get to know the adversary extremely well. And you'll also know where your defenses have surfaces and gaps that either are adjacent to, like, you know, kind of offline with their surfaces and gaps, or are in line with their surfaces and gaps, right? And it'll just really set you up to to be the most effective at defending as it possibly can be. So coming back to the ideal strategy again, highly effective weapons. Well, what is our most effective weapon in cybersecurity? Is you, right? It's the individuals, butts and seats. It's a very cerebral occupation, right? So it really has to be, the team that is maximally effective, supported by tools that enable them to be expeditious, that they're able to, operate with speed and efficiency. Wield in an adaptive manner is, establish intentions over instructions, like I talked about, right? And the intent is, we're going to try to limit our exposure and prevent a compromise as much as we possibly can. But at the point where those defenses are going to get bypassed, we really need to be effective at post-compromise detection. So the things that we need to put in place in order to be able to identify an adversary once they find their way into the environment, and then allow your team members to run through their OODA loop, right? Allow them to observe, orient, decide, and act, and tolerate the mistakes when they make them. And then targeting the enemy's gaps. Adversaries are most exposed when doing reconnaissance. So those are their biggest gaps. Focus on ways to identify that and find that behavior. Using unexpected tactics, set tripwires, stage credentials, fake services, fake documents, fake database tables, etc., with a long-term focus. Like I said, turnover is devastating. Build culture to retain talent. Okay, these are all the references that I used in doing research for this this presentation. I'm going to be, building off of this presentation in a handful of ways, diving in a little deeper to some aspects of it, doing offshoots of it with various other sort of concepts I have rattling around in my head that are semi-aligned with or adjacent to this. So anyway, these books will definitely be, sources that I'll continue to reference over and over and over again. And the last bit is, if you guys connect with me on LinkedIn or follow me on LinkedIn, I'm going to share this presentation there, so you'll be able to get access to it there. You can follow me on Twitter, Mastodon. Having limited success with Mastodon right now. I don't know. We'll see. Maybe it picks up. And yeah, obviously the website, podcast. You can follow us there as well. And if you want more T-shirts, you can get them at the gear.habit.sh website. Count here is extra though. And that's it. Any questions? Feedback? Was that crap? Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was wondering if you could please do a favor for me and repeat the fundamentals that your team needs to emphasize for a long-term play. I think it's operating system, networking, that.
Right there. That one, you want to take a snapshot of that? Yeah, so basically, this is coming from my own personal background. I'm sort of biased around this. Like I started in networking and systems engineering. So, the Havoc platform that I built, for example, I'm not a very good software developer, but I just knew what I needed to accomplish from an engineering standpoint. And I was able to piece things together, right? And that's a lot, I think, of what you do in cybersecurity is you just kind of follow threads. You grab a thread and follow it. And the only way you're really going to be able to follow those threads is we have really strong fundamentals to work off of. So that's really kind of what my position is on that. Network fundamentals, OS fundamentals, really got to have a strong sense of architecture, and then the application level stuff as well. Understanding how applications are vulnerable is hugely beneficial. Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you guys. Really appreciate the attendance.